There are people who spend their entire lives explaining themselves, not because anyone asked, not because it matters, but because somewhere deep inside they learned that their existence needs to be justified, that their choices require permission, that their silence is a debt they must repay with words. You know this person. Perhaps you are this person. You explain why you need rest, why you chose solitude over noise, why you said no, why you walked away, why you stayed. Why you feel the way you feel, as if you're in a world where a courtroom and you, perpetually on trial, must defend every breath, every boundary, every quiet truth that lives within you. And here is what no one tells you. The moment you stop explaining yourself is the moment you begin to live. Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk who traded the chaos of the world for the silence of the monastery, understood something most people never grasp. He understood that the need to explain yourself is not kindness, it is not honesty, it is not connection, it is a prison. A cage built from the judgments of others and locked from the inside by your own fear of being misunderstood. Merton wrote about the false self, the version of you that exists only to please, to perform, to justify its presence in a world that rarely bothers to understand. This false self speaks endlessly, explaining, defending, apologizing for taking up space. It believes that if it can just find the right words, the perfect explanation, then finally, it will be enough. Finally, it will be accepted. Finally, it will be free. But freedom never comes from explanation. Freedom comes from the radical act of living without needing anyone's approval. Listen carefully. This is not about arrogance. This is not about dismissing others or building walls of indifference. This is about recognizing a profound truth that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You do not owe the world a narrative that makes sense to everyone. You do not owe strangers, acquaintances, or even those close to you a detailed account of your choices, your feelings, your reasons for being exactly who you are. Because here is what happens when you live in a constant state of explanation. You stop living for yourself. Every decision becomes a performance. Every choice, a press conference. You begin to edit your life not based on what feels true, but on what can be easily explained, easily defended, easily understood by minds that may never have walked your path. You choose the safer job because it makes sense to others. You stay in relationships that drain you because leaving would require explanations you're too tired to give. You suppress your joy because it seems frivolous. You hide your pain because it seems excessive. You shrink yourself into a version that fits neatly into other people's expectations, and you call this maturity. You call this consideration. You call this love. But it is not love. It is self-abandonment. Merton knew this. He left a promising literary career in New York City, walked away from everything that made sense to the world, and entered a monastery where silence was not just practiced, but sacred. People thought he was running away. People demanded explanations. People needed to understand how someone so talented, so young, so full of potential, could choose a life that, to them, looked like death. And Merton offered no explanations. He simply lived. He sat in silence. He wrote from that silence. And in that refusal to justify his path, he found something most people never find: himself. There is a story I once heard about a woman who decided to leave her high-powered career to become a painter. She was good at her job, respected, well paid. But every morning she woke with a heaviness in her chest, a quiet desperation that no amount of success could ease. Painting called to her, not as a hobby, but as a necessity, as breathing is necessary. When she told people, they asked why. They asked if she was sure. They asked about money, stability, retirement plans. They asked if she had thought this through. They asked if something was wrong. They asked and asked and asked, and each question was a small knife, cutting away at her certainty, demanding she justify a decision that needed no justification because it was hers. She spent months explaining. She prepared speeches. She built arguments. She tried to make them understand. And the more she explained, the more exhausted she became, until one day she realized they would never understand. Not because they couldn't, but because understanding was never the point. The questions were not invitations to dialogue. They were attempts to pull her back into alignment with their expectations, their fears, their vision of what a life should look like. So she stopped explaining. She simply said, "This is my choice, and I am at peace with it." And something extraordinary happened. Some people became angry. Some became distant. But others, the ones who mattered, the ones who loved her, not for what she did, but for who she was, they simply said, "I trust you." And that was enough. This is the paradox of explanation. The more you give, the less you receive. Because people who need you to justify your existence will never be satisfied. There will always be another question, another doubt, another way in which your life fails to align with their understanding of how things should be. You can spend your entire life trying to make them understand, and you will die with that task unfinished, your own life unlived, your own truth unspoken. Merton wrote that the greatest tragedy is not death, but a life lived in the service of an illusion. And the illusion most people serve is this, that if we can just explain ourselves well enough, clearly enough, convincingly enough, we will finally earn the right to be ourselves. But you already have that right, you were born with it. It is not granted by consensus. It is not revoked by disapproval. It is not dependent on how well you can articulate your inner landscape to those who have never traveled there. Think about the times you felt most alive, the moments when something inside you rang clear and true, when you knew, without explanation, without justification, without needing anyone's approval, that this was right. This was yours. This was real. Maybe it was the decision to end something that others thought was good. Maybe it was the choice to begin something that seemed impossible. Maybe it was simply the act of saying no when everyone expected yes, or saying yes when everyone expected no. Maybe it was the moment you stopped pretending, stopped performing, stopped trying to be the version of yourself that made sense to everyone else. In those moments you were not explaining, you were living, and that is the difference. Merton spent years in silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that silence is not the absence of communication. It is the presence of truth. In silence, you stop explaining yourself to the world and start listening to yourself. In silence, the false self, the one that lives to please and perform, begins to dissolve. And what remains is something simpler, quieter, truer. Your real self, the one that does not need to be explained, the one that simply is. But here is what makes this difficult. Here is why most people never stop explaining. We are terrified of being misunderstood. We are terrified of being judged. We are terrified that if we stop explaining, people will create their own narratives about us, and those narratives will be wrong, and we will be powerless to correct them. And you know what? They will. People will misunderstand you. People will judge you. People will create stories about your choices that have nothing to do with your truth and everything to do with their fears, their limitations, their own unlived lives. This will happen. It is inevitable. And it is not your responsibility to prevent it. Because here is the truth that no one wants to hear. You cannot control how others perceive you. You can explain until your voice gives out, and still, they will see you through the lens of their own experience, their own wounds, their own expectations. They will make you the villain in their story, or the fool, or the lost one who doesn't understand. And you can spend your entire life trying to rewrite their narrative, or you can accept that their narrative is not yours to write. Merton understood this deeply. As his writings became famous, people projected onto him. They called him a mystic, a rebel, a prophet, a heretic. They praised him and condemned him, often for the same words, and he learned, slowly, painfully, that the moment you speak your truth, people will interpret it through their own lens. They will make it about them. They will misunderstand. And that misunderstanding is not your failure. It is simply the nature of being human in a world of humans. So what do? You let them misunderstand. You let them create their stories. You let them think what they think. And you keep walking. You keep choosing. You keep living from the center of your own truth, not from the perimeter of their comfort. This is not cruelty. This is not selfishness. This is self-respect. This is the understanding that your life is not a referendum. Your choices are not up for vote. Your inner world is not public property, to be dissected and debated by anyone with an opinion. There is a difference between healthy communication and compulsive explanation. Healthy communication is reciprocal. It happens in relationships where there is mutual respect, mutual care, mutual willingness to understand. In these relationships, you share not because you must justify, but because you want to include someone in your inner world. You explain not to defend, but to connect. Compulsive explanation is different. It is one-sided. It is desperate. It happens when you feel you must earn the right to your own choices, when you believe that without explanation you will lose something, someone, some essential proof of your worth. Compulsive explanation is not communication. It is negotiation with ghosts, with internalized voices, with the belief that you are fundamentally unacceptable as you are. And Merton would tell you, you are not. You are not too much. You are not too little. You are not too sensitive, too cold, too ambitious, too complacent, too anything. You are exactly as you are, and that does not require explanation. It does not require defense. It simply is. I have watched people destroy their peace, trying to explain their boundaries, trying to make others understand why they need space, why they need silence, why they cannot give what is being demanded of them. And the explanation becomes another burden, another task, another way in which they must perform their worthiness. But a boundary does not need to be understood to be respected. A no does not need to be justified to be valid. Your choices do not need to make sense to anyone but you. Imagine this. You wake tomorrow and decide that you will no longer explain yourself unless you genuinely want to, not unless you're trying to justify, not unless you're trying to manage someone else's emotions, not unless you're trying to earn permission, but only when the explanation serves connection, serves clarity, serves truth. What would change? How much lighter would you feel? How much energy would return to you, energy you've been spending on defending your existence to people who were never really asking, who were really just demanding that you conform? Merton wrote, "The beginning of love is to let those we love be perfectly themselves, and not to twist them to fit our own image. Otherwise, we love only the reflection of ourselves we find in them, and this applies to you as well. The beginning of self-love is letting yourself be perfectly yourself, not twisting your truth to fit other people's comfort. When you stop explaining, you stop contorting, you stop shrinking. You stop translating your inner world into a language that was never meant to hold it. You simply exist, fully, completely, without apology. And some people will not like this. Some people will be uncomfortable with your refusal to justify. Some people will see your silence as arrogance, your boundaries as coldness, your self-possession as selfishness. Let them. Their discomfort is not your emergency. Their need for explanation is not your obligation. Because here is what happens when you live this way. The wrong people fall away. The ones who needed you to be smaller, quieter, more explainable, they drift off. And it feels like loss. It feels like loneliness. It feels like maybe you made a mistake. Maybe you should go back. Maybe you should explain just one more time. But if you wait, if you stay steady, something else happens. The right people arrive. The ones who do not need you to justify your existence because they recognize your inherent worth. The ones who trust you. The ones who say, "I don't understand your choice, but I trust that you do." The ones who give you space to be complex, contradictory, evolving, human. These people are rare. But they are real, and they are worth the loneliness that comes from releasing everyone else. Merton spent years in solitude, and people assumed he was lonely. But he was not. He was alone, yes, but not lonely. Because loneliness is the ache of being surrounded by people who do not see you. Solitude is the peace of being alone with someone who does, yourself. And this is the gift of no longer explaining. You meet yourself, not the version you've been performing, not the one you've been defending, but the quiet, essential self that exists beneath all the noise, beneath all the justification, beneath all the fear of being misunderstood. You meet the part of you that does not need to be explained because it simply is. The part that knows its own truth without needing external validation. The part that can sit in silence and feel whole. This is not easy. This is not a one-time decision. This is a practice, a daily choosing, a constant returning to the question, whose life am I living? Mine or the one I think I need to justify? There will be moments when you slip, moments when someone's disapproval cuts so deep that you scramble to explain, to fix, to make them understand. This is human, this is normal. But notice it. Notice when you start to justify what needs no justification. Notice when you start to negotiate for something that is already yours. And gently bring yourself back. You do not owe anyone any more explanations, not for why you need rest when they think you should be productive, not for why you feel deeply in a world that rewards numbness, not for why you choose differently than they would choose, not for why you're healing, grieving, growing, changing at your own pace, in your own way. Your life is not a dissertation to be defended. It is a poem to be lived. And poems do not explain themselves. They simply are, and those who resonate will understand, and those who don't will move on. And both outcomes are perfectly fine. Merton spent the last years of his life traveling, speaking, engaging with the world again after decades of monastic silence. And people expected him to be a certain way. They expected the monk they had imagined. But he was himself, complex and contradictory, full of questions, full of life. And he offered no apologies for the ways he defied expectation. He had learned the secret. The only person you must make sense to is yourself. Everyone else is optional. So here is my invitation to you. Not a rule, not a demand, an invitation. What would it be like to stop? To simply stop explaining yourself to people who will never understand. To stop defending your choices to people who are invested in keeping you small. To stop apologizing for being exactly who you are. What would it be like to say simply and clearly, this is my choice, and let that be enough? To meet confusion with calm, to meet judgment with silence, to meet demands for explanation with a gentle, loving, I don't owe you that. What would it be like to redirect all that energy, all those words, all that desperate justification, back toward yourself? To use it to listen to your own voice, to honor your own truth, to build a life that needs no defense because it is authentically, undeniably yours. This is the freedom Merton found, not in having all the answers, not in being understood by everyone, but in releasing the need to be, in understanding that the only approval that matters is the one you give yourself. And yes, this will cost you. It will cost you people who cannot love you without understanding you. It will cost you comfort zones built on compliance. It will cost you the false peace that comes from making yourself small enough to fit in everyone's expectations. But what you gain is everything. You gain yourself. You gain your time. You gain your energy. You gain the ability to walk through this world as you are, not as you think you should be. You gain the quiet dignity of a life lived on your own terms. And in the end, when the noise fades and the opinions dissolve, and all that remains is you and the life you built, you will not regret the explanations you didn't give. You will only regret the ones you did, the moments you betrayed yourself to satisfy people who were never really listening. Merton died suddenly, far from the monastery, in Bangkok, at a conference on East-West dialogue. His death was unexpected, mysterious, just like his life. And I think about this often, how he spent his life resisting easy explanations, resisting neat categories, resisting the demand that he be one thing, understandable, containable. He remained until the end exactly who he was, complex, questioning, free. And that is what I wish for you. Not that everyone understands you, but that you understand yourself so deeply, so completely, that their misunderstanding becomes irrelevant. Not that you never have to explain, but that you explain only when it serves love, serves truth, serves genuine connection. And for everything else, for all the demands, all the expectations, all the voices that insist you justify your existence, you simply say quietly, firmly, lovingly no. Because in that no is the most profound yes. Yes to yourself. Yes to your truth. Yes to a life lived from the inside out, not the outside in. You do not owe anyone any more explanations. You never did. And the moment you truly understand this, the moment you stop defending and start living, you will discover something beautiful. You were always free. You were always enough. You were always whole. You just needed to stop explaining it and start believing it. And belief, real belief, does not announce itself, it does not justify, it does not defend. It simply walks forward, quiet and certain, into a life that needs no permission from anyone. This is your invitation. This is your freedom. This is the truth Merton lived and died by. You are not here to make sense to everyone. You are here to make peace with yourself. And that peace begins the moment you put down the burden of explanation and pick up the gift of simply being. Walk free. There was a time when I believed that being understood was the ultimate form of connection. I thought that if I could just explain myself clearly enough, thoroughly enough, honestly enough, people would see me as I truly am. And in that seeing I would finally belong, finally be accepted, finally be home. I spent years perfecting this art. I became fluent in the language of justification. I learned to preempt questions, to smooth rough edges, to translate my inner complexity into bite-sized explanations that others could digest without discomfort. I thought this was emotional intelligence. I thought this was maturity. I thought this was love. But it was exhaustion, because every explanation became a negotiation. Every choice a court case, every feeling evidence to be examined, and I was always on trial, always defending, always trying to prove that I had the right to be exactly who I was. Merton wrote about the violence of always being examined, not physical violence, but the slow erosion of self that happens when you live under constant scrutiny, when every aspect of your being becomes subject to other people's approval or disapproval. He called it the violence of definition, the way others try to define you, contain you, reduce you to something manageable, something that fits their worldview. And the only way to escape this violence is to refuse to participate, to stop handing over your self-definition, to stop allowing others to be the authority on your own experience. This sounds simple. It is not, because we are taught from the earliest age that explanation equals responsibility, that justification equals respect, that if we cannot articulate why we feel, think, choose the way we do, then perhaps we haven't thought it through. Perhaps we're being impulsive, selfish, unclear. But some things cannot be explained. Some truths live in the body, in the intuition, in the quiet knowing that precedes language. Some choices are right not because they make logical sense, but because they align with something deeper, something that does not translate into words. I knew someone once who left a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. Good person, stable life, no dramatic problems that others could point to. And when she left, people demanded explanations. They needed to understand. They needed a villain, a crisis, a reason that made sense within their framework of how relationships work. But she had none of those things to offer. She simply knew, in the deepest part of herself, that she was dying. Not physically, but spiritually. She was becoming someone she didn't recognize, someone who smiled on cue, who said the right things, who performed contentment while drowning in quiet desperation. And she tried to explain this. She tried to put into words the slow suffocation of living a life that looks right, but feels wrong. But words failed. They always do when you're trying to explain soul-level truth to people who are asking for evidence-level facts. So eventually, she stopped trying. She simply said, "This is not right for me and I am choosing myself." And the people who loved her, truly loved her, said, okay. They didn't understand, but they trusted. And the people who needed her to stay explainable, they fell away, angry and confused and certain she was making a mistake. Years later, I asked her if she regretted it. She said no. Not the leaving, not the silence. The only thing she regretted was how much energy she spent trying to make people understand a decision that was never theirs to make. This is what Merton understood about solitude. It was not about hating people or avoiding connection. It was about creating space where he didn't have to explain himself, where he could simply be without the constant translation, without the performance, without the need to make his inner life accessible to those who were not equipped to hold it. Your unexplained self, the version of you that exists without justification, without apology, without the need to be understood by anyone other than you. This is the self that Merton called the true self, the one that is hidden beneath layers of social conditioning, beneath the need to please, beneath the fear of being rejected. This self does not explain because it does not need to. It knows its own truth with a certainty that requires no external validation. And when you touch this self, even briefly, you understand why Merton gave up everything to protect it. Because this self is freedom, this self is peace, this self is home. But accessing it requires something most people are not willing to do. You must disappoint people. You must let them misunderstand. You must allow them to create narratives about you that are completely false. And you must not correct them. You must choose your inner peace over their comfort. Most people think love means constant availability, constant explanation, constant accommodation. But Merton understood a different kind of love. A love that says, I care about you enough to be honest. I care about you enough to not pretend. I care about you enough to show up as I truly am, rather than as who you need me to be. And sometimes this love looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like a gentle but firm refusal to explain, to justify, to make yourself small enough to fit into someone else's comfort zone. Because real love requires that both people are free, and you cannot be free if you are constantly justifying your existence. Freedom requires privacy. It requires mystery. It requires aspects of yourself that you do not share, not because you're hiding, but because some things are sacred. Some things belong only to you, and this is not isolation. This is integrity. Merton had deep friendships. He wrote thousands of letters. He engaged with thinkers, activists, seekers from around the world, but he engaged on his own terms, from a place of wholeness rather than need. He shared what he wanted to share, not what he felt obligated to share. When you stop explaining yourself out of obligation, what remains is choice. You can choose to share, to open, to invite someone into your inner world. But it is an invitation, not a hostage negotiation. It is a gift, not a payment. Not everyone is meant to understand you. Not everyone is equipped to hold your truth. Not everyone has earned the right to your inner world. And recognizing this is not judgment. It is discernment. It is wisdom. You can be kind to someone without explaining yourself to them. You can be respectful without justifying your choices. You can maintain connection without sacrificing your privacy. But here is what I have learned. The people who truly love you do not need endless explanations. They see you, they trust you. They give you space to be complex, to change, to choose differently than they would choose. And the people who demand constant explanation, who need you to justify every boundary, every choice, every feeling, they are not trying to understand you. They are trying to control you. And you can spend your entire life trying to satisfy them, or you can accept that satisfaction is not the point. Control is the point. And you can choose clearly and firmly to not be controlled. This is the work, not explaining yourself, not justifying, not apologizing for being exactly who you are. And not once, not as a grand gesture, but daily, moment by moment, conversation by conversation, choosing your truth over their comfort. And yes, it will be lonely sometimes. Yes, it will be hard. Yes, you will doubt yourself. You will wonder if maybe you should explain, maybe you should justify, maybe you owe them more. You don't. You owe yourself the life you were meant to live. You owe yourself the freedom to choose without permission. You owe yourself the peace that comes from no longer performing, no longer defending, no longer shrinking. And when you give yourself this, when you truly release the need to be understood by everyone, something miraculous happens. You become more yourself, more whole, more present, more alive, because you're no longer spending your energy on translation. You're simply here, fully, completely, without apology. And this version of you, the unexplained version, the one that exists beyond justification, this version is the one that Merton spent his life protecting. This version is the one worth everything. So stop explaining. Stop justifying. Stop apologizing for taking up space, for having boundaries, for choosing differently, for being more complex than they expected. Just be. Just live. Just walk forward into your own life with the quiet certainty that you do not need anyone's permission to exist exactly as you are, because you were never meant to make sense to everyone. You were only ever meant to make peace with yourself. And that peace begins the moment you put down the burden of explanation and pick up the truth of your own inherent worth. You do not owe anyone any more explanations. Walk free.